Hello, and welcome to the Family Histories Podcast, the show for those of us sat quietly in libraries, archives, and spare rooms all around the world, tirelessly piecing together our collective social and family history. My name is Andrew Martin, I'm a family historian, and I'll be your host. In this episode, The Salesman, we'll be hearing about a man whose early life was revealed by newspapers and repeatedly republished for 20 years. And then we're looking for the origins of a 19th century actor of Philadelphia, USA, who has possible Irish connections. So, put down that old microfiche, grab a cuppa, and let's meet our guest. My guest today is a public and community historian who graduated with a BA in History and a minor in Research and Information Studies in 2025. Congratulations. His work has led him to research the lives of our LGBTQ+ relatives, and in particular US trans people, through his Transgender Ancestors project. So, before he gets distracted by another old document, I really should welcome my guest. It's Ulysses Swanson. Hello, Ulysses. Welcome to the Family Histories Podcast.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm really glad to be here.
I'm really excited to talk to you. Now, as our regular listeners know, we always start with the same first question, which is, how did you become interested in researching family history?
Well, I can't really get into that story without talking about my first false start.
Okay.
So in July 21, I married my long-term partner. I got caught up in the hype around the marriage. Everyone was talking about not only our relationship story, but how we as two people got here. And I became more curious about that history myself. Like, of all the ancestors, I came here. All of my spouse's ancestors, they're there. So I joined Family Search because it was free, and WikiTree because I'm more familiar with wikis as a format, and started exploring those questions. I learned really quick. Again, it was a bit of a false start because it ended up being that my spouse's family had already done this research, and my own family had already been part of this research before. My spouse, one side keeps an active family Bible that I got to participate in 22, which was awesome. And on the other side, there was a grandparent who was on Ancestry religiously every week. And I'm like, okay, so we know what's happening on your side. My side, on my mother's side, the ethnic background is Germans from Russia. This is specifically part of a clan of Black Sea Germans who moved to North Dakota, which are a very tight-knit group. Like, my great-grandmother was pen pals with Brother Placid Gross, who wrote a lot about the history of Germans from Russia. So that history was already completely found out. And my dad's story is a little different. He's an adoptee. He didn't really get along with his foster family and doesn't really care about his bio family. So to him, his family tree starts with him, and I respect that completely. So on all ends, I was seeing that, the story of my family has been written, and so I ended up stopping at that point.
So how did you kind of find kind of documents or evidence that could maybe kind of push you further out from that base?
Yeah, so I consider this is my real start, and it started by a really bad attempt to make a joke.
Okay.
I was poking at my recent marriage, my this life transition, my masculinity, and at this point I was unemployed. I had more of a domestic role in my relationship, so I made this terrible joke. I'm like, I've transitioned from female husband to male wife, and it just sparked something in my brain. I was like, has this combination of words ever been used before? And I looked it up, and a newspaper article came up, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. It was titled The Female Husband and Male Wife, which answered that question super fast. But then I saw the date the article was from was 1868.
1868. Wow.
Yeah, it was like 2,000 words long, and it was this fascinating narrative of a man named Dr. Burnham and his daughter who lived in Broadhead, Wisconsin. This daughter had all these roles in the community: assistant at the drugstore, piano tutor, marries a local. Civil War happens. She's arrested for being a male spy in women's clothes. And this article just went on to describe this incredible transformation, this tipping point where the family and the husband rallied around him and then helped him reintegrate into society as a man, getting him clothes, vetting his experience. And then at the end of the article, he's recently married to a local woman. I saw that and I was like, what a fascinating story. You don't hear about these sorts of stories. I wonder what the rest of his life was like. And then it clicked. I'm like, 3 months ago, I was learning about how to trace the history of people who lived in the 19th century. I could use those same tools to do the exact same thing here. And it was 2 days of mad research, and I flushed out his story. I went at least 5 generations back for all of the lines connected to him, and I was like, I'm hooked. This is so fascinating. I hadn't been hooked like that in a long time on any sort of topic.
You'd got the bug.
Yeah.
So you've set up a Transgender Ancestors project. What is that project and what inspired you to set it up?
So after I did all this research for Edgar's story, I started finding a couple more stories like his. Talking to friends, like word of mouth, reading like academic papers about this one person who lived here, et cetera, et cetera. And I was creating all these profiles on Wikitree for essentially transgender people. Obviously, that term wasn't a term at the time, but it's just an easier way to explain that people change their genders. Like, at least we have a modern term instead of all these euphemisms from the past. But it was around July of 2022, and I realized I'd written perhaps a lot of profiles like this and found a lot of profiles on Wikitree. Wikitree is fascinating because there's this tagging system, so you can find likewise ancestors, like people buried in the same cemetery or people who suffered the same disease. And there was this poorly managed tag LGBT. And I was tagging all of these people within that, and I realized their stories just don't pop when they're within a mass of names. And that's really where I started Transgender Ancestors, was a way to collate these.
Yeah.
But it was also from the feedback I was getting from people who were finding these profiles within their own family trees and going, this is such a fascinating story. I never knew my ancestor had a life like this. And a lot of those messages were from people who are descendants, cousins of cousins of cousins of Edgar.
So what made you pick Wikitree as well? Because I haven't used Wikitree a great deal. I've got an account on there, but I'm often using Ancestry or Find My Past and that kind of thing to build a tree. I have a software as well on my computer that's all nicely backed up. But what made you want to use Wikitree?
It was twofold. I was familiar with Wikipedia as a way of publishing content, and
Sure.
I like the ability to link materials to each other that aren't necessarily otherwise linked. But there was also, I didn't feel the necessity to have private software because I wasn't working on a private family tree, and I wasn't finding great ways to contact living relatives of all these people I was researching anyway. A lot of them, that's the end of the tree anyway, so I wasn't finding people whose family Bibles I could present material to.
Sure. So how do you research transgender ancestors? Because I would imagine that it's quite hard to find information about them, because the records that I know I'm familiar with, say censuses or things like birth records, they're not, I guess, going to yield the information that would be able to tell those stories.
Yeah, it's all through, I don't know how to explain. I'm working from the outside in for all of these stories.
Okay.
The main way is going through newspaper records and then going back to censuses and vital records to verify these stories. But even within censuses and vital records, there's marginalia that we can look for. A couple examples pop to mind. There's somebody named Joseph Monahan in Hawaii, Idaho in 1880. And if you look at his line on the 1880 U.S. Census, one of the boxes that's supposed to be for like economic data, it just says doubtful sex.
Oh.
I've seen death records where people have crossed out genders or amended the marriage because, same-sex marriage wasn't legal in the 19th century. So once somebody's found out to be a certain gender, they're like, oh, their marriage wasn't legal. So there's one, I believe it was for Neil Garris, who was from Los Angeles County. The M is crossed out and it says F on his death certificate. And then on top of married, it just says never married.
Wow. So there's kind of additional pieces of information that might be tucked away in there. And I guess the unusual presence of these kind of perhaps sometimes cryptic answers or cryptic alterations is what's kind of giving you an idea that maybe this person warrants some more research, and then you're able to go through the rest of the records.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Or even looking at newspaper stories first is, that there's a catalyst, there's some sort of tipping point where you're looking for records under one name before a certain time and records under a different name at another time, and you're just seeing how many of the details actually match up. Lately, I've been looking into stories from the early 20th century of people who are like, my mother actually wanted a daughter, so she raised me as a daughter for all my life, but now I'm going to live as a man. The veracity of those stories is questionable, but there's the proof when you look at the census records. You'll look at 1910, and this family has a daughter who would be around the same age as the person in the story, and then, looking 10 years later at 1920, now they have a son, exact same age, very similar details. So it's never one record that can help tell these stories.
Yeah.
It's always in comparison and always looking in the margins.
And you've also mentioned newspapers there, and I guess maybe the newspapers are not particularly pleasant towards the trans community. Have you a sense of whether the attitudes towards women who have transitioned to men is worse in the newspapers to men who've transitioned to women? What's your kind of sense of how that is handled by the press and historical records?
It's almost not even comparative. For a lot of these women who transition to men, sometimes you'll have women in male attire, these euphemisms. There's this belief that it's romantic. It's led by, stories of adventurers during wars, especially. It's like, the rallying cry to defend your country has made even these women want to fight.
Okay.
There's more often stories of acceptance from there. A lot of people integrated into their communities fully as men or as female husbands, or, in those cases. That's a great article. I wish I could remember what it was from, but it was opining about this same thing. It was around the 1890s, the new woman panic in the United States, where they're like, you hear all these stories of women in men's attire, but you never hear stories of men in women's attire, because who would want to wear women's attire? It was in a ladies' journal magazine, and I'm like, that's funny. But yeah, you don't see that story the other way around. A lot of people who we would consider to be trans women, they would hide within their communities if possible, but upon death, all respect was, out the back window.
Yeah, I bet. So is Transgender Ancestors Project, is that kind of collating information? So if there's a listener who does have a transgender relative in their tree, is there part of the project that kind of takes that information and adds it to Wikitree, or how is that working?
So it works more as a writing guide and a research guide, much closer to a writing guide, because this is still an area that's underdeveloped even within LGBT genealogy.
Okay.
I think of the writings of Michael J. Leclerc, who is just synonymous with this area to me. He wrote an article for Ancestry's blog, and he has all these handouts and webinars on LGBTQ genealogy, but how to treat your transgender ancestor it's still very underdeveloped. But the ethos behind the project is that you had this ancestor who lived in this certain way, and whether you're making a standard family Bible or you're putting them on Wikitree or using your own software, what are some narrative techniques and just technological techniques that blend presenting that story authentically with being coherent,
Yeah, I think that probably walks me into my next question, which is there anything that you'd like to see improve within our community or industry?
I could say many things.
Go for it.
I'll start with technology. Obviously, it's on the front of my brain. Attitudes towards LGBT genealogy, some are very positive. I've gotten so many wonderful comments. There are people who, agree and disagree with what I've presented to transgender ancestors, but they're so kind about it. And I'm just glad to see thoughtful responses. And then on the other side, there are people who are like, why are we even looking into trans people in history? That doesn't exist. And it's like, I don't know what to tell you. You can look at 2 census records and see that somebody's gender changed. So it is a thing. And it's something we should be thinking about.
Yeah.
But, this is a conversation that's been pigeonholed to black sheep genealogy for so long that the more mainstream it becomes, the more that the techniques within black sheep genealogy aren't reaching the masses. And there's also this belief that AI and other technologies like that will be the solution to addressing diverse ancestors, finding diverse ancestors, and that's just simply not true.
Right.
Like that doubtful sex marginalia that I brought up as an example, Family Search's full text cannot find it. It cannot interpret that. Or even, there's all the sections on the census for disability in the United States, usually blindness and deafness or muteness. AI can't even capture that, and that's not what human documenters have been trained to do for Family Search. So we're relying too much on our tough mental block as a community, and we have this oversimplified solution that's been presented, but it's not going to change attitudes. It's not going to change bad data practices that have led to this point.
Right. So to flip this, what's your favorite part of researching family history?
I love finding the stories. I think that's just my favorite part of doing family history. There are all sorts of lives that have been lived. And okay, I'm a bit of a negative Nelly. I'm just going to go back to wiki tree. You're trying to fill out a tree really fast and then come back to it. The story begins and ends. This person was born this time. They got married this time. They had this many kids. They passed away. And it's the skeleton of a life that's been lived. So my favorite part in family history is when you can flesh it out because of newspaper articles and strange records. We're able to flesh out these amazing stories. And especially people whose family trees end, whether they're LGBT or another reason, they always seem to have the most fascinating stories when I'm doing research. So digging those out and knowing that it's an interesting story, but there's probably not somebody researching it because there's no direct ancestral link. It's my favorite part. It's just bringing it all back to life.
When you research a family tree, you never quite know who you'll meet. And unless you dig deeper than just names and dates, you may miss out on some fascinating stories. With this in mind, it's now time for my guest to pick one of the people that they've researched and share their life story. Okay, Ulysses, who are you going to introduce us to?
I'm going to introduce everybody to Edgar Burnham. He's the reason I'm into genealogy, and his story is a wild ride all the way through.
Well, I'm holding tight. Let's go.
So when Edgar Burnham was born on March 18th, 1841 in Woodstock, Vermont, he was actually named after his mother, Ellen, formerly Ellen Blish, who at that point had been living her entire life in Woodstock. His father, Milo Burnham, was also a lifelong Vermonter.
Okay.
Sometime during the first 6 years of his life, the Burnhams moved to Lawrence, New York, which was home to a prominent medical school. And this is where his younger brother Justice was born in 1847. In 1856, the village of Brodhead, Wisconsin was platted. This is also when the Burnhams moved to the village, and Dr. Burnham became the first druggist in town. At 15, Edgar was the prominent daughter of a prominent man. He worked as the assistant at the very creatively named Brodhead drugstore, and he tutored other women and girls in piano, which he was noted to be proficient in.
Okay, well, it sounds like they're all settled in Broadland. So what happens next?
In 1859, Ellen Burnham began courting Luke Winthrop, also known as L.W. Powell. Powell had been the principal of the village school until around this time.
Okay.
When the couple finally married in February of 1860, Powell had started the Brodhead Reporter, which was the village's first newspaper. And the marriage itself took place in the Burnhams' home, and the Powells lived there as well, according to the census taken that summer. Right after 1860 is when details about his life become a little fuzzy. So there's a story that would be reprinted ad nauseum in newspapers starting in 1868 that at the beginning of the Civil War, Powell was appointed to be a state agent, accompanied the 7th Wisconsin Volunteers to Washington, D.C. Edgar allegedly came with him, but on the train ride back, the detective arrested Mrs. Powell under the assumption that she was a male Confederate spy in women's clothes. There just aren't records from that time to corroborate that. I've done research into this. Jonathan W. White, who wrote an article about this supposed arrest for the Civil War History Journal, couldn't find anything. So this part of the story is uncorroborated. But we do know sometime between 1860 and 1863 is where Edgar comes of age. The story's tricky because of all the reprints there have been and all the details that have been added and taken out. A lot of articles that were published in 1868 and later talked about Powell and Edgar absconding to Chicago, Powell helping Edgar gain men's clothes. Edgar's father helping him start working at a drugstore somewhere in Chicago. And those minutiae just can't be proved. But we do have evidence that there's a news article from Chicago from the spring of 1863 that mentions that Edgar Burnham hasn't picked up his mail yet.
Right.
There's an advertisement in the Broadhead Independent, which was a competitor to the Reporter, for the Broadhead drugstore that announces that Dr. Burnham is now in business with his son, Edgar W. Burnham, and the store is actually renamed to M.L. Burnham and Son. So, we could tell that the formerly known Ellen Powell has become Edgar Wales Burnham by the spring of 1863, and that transformation did include living in Illinois for a little bit, and that there was support from the family and the former husband. There is proof that Powell absconded to Chicago and never returns to Wisconsin, and there's also a family Bible from 1905 that lists Edgar as Edgar Wales Burnham. It doesn't have any other name.
Okay.
So from this point in the 1860s, that is his name, that is his legacy within this family. So after he returned, there's these ads for M.L. Burnham and Son. There's also ads for Burnham's services as a piano salesman and tutor. The family leaves Wisconsin in late 1864. They move to Waterloo, Iowa. Edgar very briefly returns to this part of Wisconsin, though, in 1865 to marry one of his former students, Miss Gertrude Everett. And then both of them end up moving to Waterloo as well, which ties a nice bow on this story.
Yeah, sounds like a nice happy ending.
And he would have lived a quiet life until 1868.
I thought there would be a but. What happened?
A glut of newspaper articles come out about his gender transformation. That's one of the ways it's described in the newspapers. The story first breaks in Waterloo, Iowa in January and is reprinted dozens of times across the United States. In February, the Broadhead Independent comes in with a lengthy correction to that original story and is relatively respectful about his life story. We're talking about mid-19th century newspapers. There's still touchiness and, frankly, rudeness about what we would now call intersex people, but they're like, at the end of the day, he became a prominent man in our community, so we respect that. And reprints beyond this point should respect that too. And did they? Some did, some didn't. But ultimately, the story about him would be reprinted hundreds of times within 1868 and would still continuously be reprinted until 1889.
Wow.
Which I can't imagine an event in my life being reported about for 25 years after it happened.
Wow. What was the kind of trigger in 1868 for this story to actually be published anyway?
So there are two possibilities, which is my way of saying there's no confirmed way, but
okay.
In 1868, two things were true at once. There was a long downslide happening in L.W. Powell's career as a reporter. His marriage is officially nullified in 1863. He moves to Chicago. He gets part-time work as a reporter, but ultimately he's not in the newspaper world in a substantial way. So this may have been his way of trying to re-engage that world and show himself off as a reporter. But if that's true, his byline is not attached. Otherwise, the official given story is that a reporter from Waterloo was fascinated and curious about this newer citizen of Waterloo and wanted to do some investigative journalism because that was starting to become en vogue. The first investigative journalism in the United States that you can really pin down is 1865, end of the Civil War, and it was verifying if the story of Jefferson Davis escaping the Union soldiers in women's clothes was true or not. So investigative journalism had this focus on outlandish stories and a little bit of focus on gender and people being gender nonconforming. So that would slot very well within this timeline that, 3 years after this, you hear about somebody who's moved into your community who, had a gender transformation, or maybe a woman in man's clothes, or was a man in women's clothes, and following that story would have been in vogue.
Wow. Do you have a thought as to which one it might be? Or maybe it was a combination. I don't know, because it's a very well-timed, I'm doing air quotes here, well-timed combination, because it's not well-timed at all, but you know what I mean.
I lean towards the Powell camp, but there really isn't proof. That would seem most likely to me, but that also could just be how he was presented by people who would have been his contemporaries. That last article that mentions Burnham in 1889 focuses a lot on how Powell at that time is a drunk living on the streets of Chicago who has lost all of his fame. So this narrative of him becoming a lousy reporter and then a useless member of society was also something that was contained within newspapers as well. So maybe I'm being influenced by those reporters too.
Maybe. I mean, it sounds from that report about his character and his situation, it almost sounds like, he's not the greatest of people, but then maybe they are reporting and he thought, I'm down on my luck, I've got a story that could make me some money and kind of lift me out of this situation because I've got this information. And maybe he did that.
Yeah, it also explained too, because a lot of the details that were in these 1868 stories, especially, they paint him in a very good light. They present him as the principal of a school when they were courting. He wasn't the principal of a school; he was a state agent, and it's like that was a very prestigious role. He was not that prominent within Rock and Greene counties, so
yeah,
I don't know. Speculating about the dead, how terrible.
That's family history research for you. So what becomes of Edgar after this?
So despite the outcropping of stories that are continuously reprinted about him, he lives a rather mundane and successful life. In Waterloo, he works as a druggist, like his father before him, and then later he opens something called the Edgar Burnham Novelty Company, which is a playhouse where he can play piano and his wife can play piano and sing. He struggles with these sort of normal events that are a normal level of tragic happen in his life. Like his brother passes away in 1878. In the winter of 1889, Edgar and Gertrude move to San Diego in California, where he works in insurance. He also continues to be involved in music. He's doing these things like patenting like music leaf turners and just being there for that community too. But Gertrude passes away in 1891. And then his father and mother also pass away in that decade as well after moving to Chicago. Because of the 1890 census disappearing in the records, it's a little unclear what happens in that decade. But we do know that he remarries. He marries somebody named Teresa Ryan. In 1900, they live in Chicago with her 3 children from a previous relationship, Dorothy, Kathleen, Malcolm, and they all share his last name. And Edgar remains with Teresa in Chicago for the rest of his life. He's selling. Okay, that sounds weird. He's selling organs, piano organs, in Chicago, and then retires.
I'm glad you clarified that.
Every time I've written it down, it says organ salesman. I'm like, that doesn't quite sound right. He worked as an organ salesman. Then he retires, and he passes away in 1918, and he's buried in a local cemetery in Chicago.
Wow. And does Edgar get kind of the usual kind of headstone and obituary as well?
I have not been able to find his obituary, but I know he is buried in a mausoleum at Oakwood Cemetery, and that it reads Edgar W. Burnham.
Okay. Well, it certainly sounds like Edgar has lived quite the life, and certainly in the face of some ferocious newspapers, but it sounds like Edgar came to a nice, stable family situation towards the end, which is good.
I think the reason I'm still drawn to his story is because it's probably the most hopeful of the stories I've researched. Not everyone who transforms their gender in the 19th century gets to continue living as that gender. There's a lot of people who had that back and forth. There's Francis Outcult, also known as Frank Du Bois, who hated his birth name, so effectively transitions to a man, lives in Wisconsin, is found out because he also had run away from a husband, is dragged back to Illinois, and is expected to live as a woman the rest of his life, and she does. But once her first husband dies, she gets remarried and starts going by Francis, which was not her birth name. And even though she's living as a woman, like that being Frank is still part of her. So it's just powerful to see that there are all sorts of lives lived, and they're all documented on transgender ancestors. But the ones where people just had a family and could live that normal cycle after this one event, they're fascinating and they're hope bringing.
And I think everyone likes a story of hope. But it's very appealing that stories in this particular period about transgender people have hope in them. So thank you so much, Ulysses, for sharing the life story of Edgar Wales Burnham. But I think it's now time for you to face The Brick Wall. It won't take you long until you hit a research dead end, or as we call it, a brick wall. And when you do, it could be in your way for hours, weeks, years, or forever, thanks to damaged or lost records or a mistranscribed index. But sometimes all you need is a little bit of help to make a breakthrough. Yes, it's time for my guest to share one of their brick walls in a hope that one of you, dear listeners, can help to turn the brick wall into brick dust. So, Ulysses, how can we help?
As you might imagine, the type of research I do, I encounter a lot of brick walls.
Yeah.
Some are just hitting my own head against the wall, and there are many that I could definitely use help with. The one on the forefront of my mind is looking for records for John Talboy Binns, also known as Sally Binns.
Okay.
The great part of this story is we know that she was allegedly an Irish immigrant in the United States who, in February 16th, 1853, was admitted to the Philadelphia Almshouse, also known as the State Hospital. And we have records 1860 and later till her death in 1882 that she lived at this almshouse and passed away there. I want to know and have help with finding her life before she lived in the United States and help finding her internment records for the almshouse. So again, she was born John Talboy Binns, obviously would have been listed as male in records.
Yeah.
All we really have besides census records is this newspaper article titled "A Queer Character Gone" that is a little fantastic in its description of this possible actor who was so obsessed with playing women on the stage that he developed monomania. But it would be lovely to see the actual story of John or Sally, and especially on WikiTree, connecting her to the rest of her family tree and to the global tree.
Yeah. So you've said the name here, John Talboy Binns, later known as Sally. How are you spelling Talboy and Binns?
Talboy is spelled Talboy, so not completely tall and boy, but you just drop that L. And Binns is spelled with two N's.
And do you find that that's fairly consistent?
It's relatively consistent. Talboy is spelled the same and is sometimes used as that first name instead of as a middle name.
Okay.
Binns is spelled consistently as well.
Okay, that's great. And so you're looking for information on the
records before and up to Sally being institutionalized.
And is there an estimate of when Sally was born?
The estimate is around 1812.
And at what point is your first US record?
The first US record is 1860, but the newspaper article from at the end of her life mentions that she would have been in the US as late as 1853 would be the first time she was in the US.
So she arrived at least early 1850s, possibly sometime before, and it's suspected that Sally is from an Irish background.
Yeah.
And do you know where the suspicion comes from at all?
Where I'm finding it is that newspaper article, and I'm seeing it repeated in censuses, but that isn't necessarily the case. U.S. censuses were very idiosyncratic. If someone thought you were a certain way, they might write that down as well. So,
and I guess maybe if you knew that somebody'd written it one way, you might have thought, yeah, actually, I quite like being Irish, so I'll be Irish from the censuses from now on. I'm sure that's a minority of people who would do that, and I'm obviously not asking people to do that next time there's a US census, but yeah, so maybe Sally was an Irish immigrant into the US. So okay, well, what's the best way for listeners to make contact if they think that they have a clue or a research idea?
If you're already on WikiTree and you have an idea where to look, you can either send me a private message or start editing her profile. If you're not on WikiTree and you want to contact me a different way, you can email me at Ulysses Swanson at AOL.com.
Of course, we'll put links to the WikiTree pages and transgender ancestors in the description and show notes for this episode. And of course, listeners can head over to familyhistoriespodcast.com where they can read those episode show notes and they can send us a message, or they can just email us at hello@familyhistoriespodcast.com and we'll pass the message along to Ulysses. Now, While our listeners don their brick wall busting hard hats, it's possible that I could be of some help with this, but you'll need to follow me through to the garage.
All right, let's go.
Well, here we go. One secret time machine.
A secret time machine for real?
Oh yes, and this is my assistant, the 19th century Hungarian poet and revolutionary, Sándor Petőfi.
Hello, Sándor.
Hello.
19th century, wow.
Well, that's the magic of time travel.
So I guess it works then.
It certainly does. Just last week in the 18th century, I was wowing high society with loads of pineapples that I'd bought here from my local supermarket. Mind you, I might have accidentally invented the barcode a few centuries earlier too, but they don't have a zapper, so we should be alright. Either way, all that to say that this is a fully functional, highly scientifically calibrated time machine.
So, what does this bit do?
That? Oh, it's a...
Didactic atom oscillator.
Ah! I have no idea what that means.
Don't worry, I'll explain later. Anyway, for now, Ulysses, I wondered whether you'd like to have a little trip back in time. You could use it to solve that brick wall for yourself by visiting Sally. No, you could ask those questions in person.
That'd be great! Is it safe though?
Very.
Sort of.
Sort of very safe. Just don't do anything that changes the future in case it changes your future or even erases you completely. Other than that, you'll be fine. So, grab a seat and let's get started. That's it. Okay, when and where would you like to go to?
Let's start by going back to February 16th, 1853. The Philadelphia Almshouse in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, United States.
1853 is our set.
Excellent. And that's Philadelphia all sorted too. Oh, you'll need this.
What's that?
It's a temporal beacon. Keep it with you at all times, and then when you're ready to come home, just tap the button on the top and you'll be right back here.
This one?
Don't press that. That's the emergency goose whistle. It's the next one. Yep, that's the one.
Got it.
Ready?
Right, here we go. Ulysses Swanson. Thank you, goodbye, good luck.
It's all good.
Good. So, remind me, what does the didactic attack otter thingy do?
I will explain later.
Oh, okay. The Family Histories podcast was presented and produced by me, Andrew Martin. My guest was the brilliant Ulysses Swanson with John Spike as Sándor Petőfi. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not leave us a rating or review on your favourite podcast platform? Thank you for listening. Approximately no family historians were harmed in the making of this podcast.